Hi everyone, my name is Diana and I'm a second year university student at King's College London studying international relations. And over the past few weeks, I've been completing an internship with Arts for Refugees. In this podcast, I'm going to talk you through why I chose to do this internship, why it was so important to me, and I'm also going to talk you through my research, the topic I've chosen, and essentially teach you more about it. So first of all, I chose to do this internship because of something I've noticed throughout my degree. We spend a lot of time studying conflict, how wars begin, why extremist groups arise, how political systems collapse, and how power shifts. We also analyse causes and consequences in a very structured way, which is very important. But what I realised is that we don't spend enough time looking at what happens after the conflict formally ends. We don't always sit with the long-term reality of rebuilding. Post-conflict recovery often becomes reduced to statistics, which essentially means that we've dehumanised the experience of people to simply looking at them as numbers. We hear that thousands were killed or that hundreds of thousands were displaced, but we don't always ask what rebuilding identity, dignity, and community actually looks like on the ground. That's what drew me to this internship. Arts for Refugees focuses on the aftermath, the years after the violence, and that shift in focus completely changed how I approach my project. I was also really happy to know that in this internship, it's very flexible. You have the ability to choose your own topic, which I find very interesting. Again, with university coursework and assignments and all the topics that we study, we rarely have the freedom to essentially pick the topic we feel very close to or attached to. So this internship was essentially very important to me because it gave me the freedom to research a topic that means a lot to me. For my article, I wrote about Yazidi women nearly a decade after the ISIS genocide. The title I chose is Where Do You Belong After Genocide? The Story of Yazidi Women and the Fight for the Home. I kept coming back to the idea of belonging because the more I researched, the more I realised that survival and belonging are not the same thing. To understand why, it's important to briefly explain what happened in 2014. So in August of that year, ISIS attacked the Yazidi community in Sinjar in northern Iraq. ISIS viewed the Yazidis as religious outsiders and justified violence against them on that basis. Thousands of Yazidis men were killed, young boys were separated from their families and forced into training camps. More than 6,000 women and children were abducted. In particular, women were deliberately targeted. They were sold in slave markets, forced into marriages and subjected to repeated abuse. Families were separated intentionally as a way to dismantle and separate the community from within. The violence was not random. It was systematic and aimed at destroying the Yazidis as a community. The United Nations later recognized these events as genocide. In 2019, ISIS lost its final territorial stronghold. The so-called caliphate collapsed, but the damage left behind did not disappear within it. Nearly 10 years later, between 250,000 and 300,000 Yazidis are still living in displacement camps across northern Iraq. Many villages in Sinjar were destroyed, and reconstruction has been slow. There was a political agreement in 2020 meant to stabilise the region, but progress has been really uneven. This is because jobs are limited, infrastructure remains fragile, and some families still do not feel secure enough to return to home. When I began researching, one of the first things I realised was that I did not fully understand the Yazidi religion itself. I definitely heard about the genocide before, but I hadn't really understood who the Yazidis were beyond being victims of ISIS. I felt that it was if I was going to write responsibly about the community, I needed to understand their identity in its own terms. So because of that, I did more research into it. So Yazidism is an ancient religion that is also ethnically rooted. You cannot convert into it. You are essentially born into it. Therefore, belonging is passed down through family lineage and there are strict community rules around marriage and identity. At first, I interpreted this as rigid, but as I continued reading, I realised that these structures developed over centuries of persecution. Protecting identity was a way of surviving repeated attempts at erasing the community. That context became incredibly important when I started reading about what happened when women returned from captivity. Yazidi religious leaders made a public decision to welcome the women back into the faith. In many societies, survivors of sexual violence face stigma or exclusion, but here, the leadership made it clear that what had been done to them did not change who they were. That decision restored a sense of dignity and belonging for many women. However, some women returned with children born during captivity. Under traditional Yazidi religious rules, belonging is inherited through lineage, and conversion is not recognised. This created a painful internal debate within the community about whether children fathered by ISIS fighters could even be considered as Yazidi. For many religious authorities, the answer remained no. The reason behind this position is often framed as protection. Before 2014, the global Yazidi population was already relatively small. Thousands were killed during the genocide, and many families have since resettled in Europe. After an event like this, fears about demographic survival became really intensified, and therefore maintaining strict identity boundaries can feel like preserving the community's future. But for the women raising these children, this debate had very personal consequences. It affects whether they feel able to return home, how the children are treated socially, and what kind of future they can imagine for their families. Some women have chosen to remain in displaced camps because they're uncertain about how their children will be received in their villages. Others have migrated abroad. This is where I began to understand that post-conflict recovery is not only about physical reconstruction, it is about negotiating identity in the aftermath of trauma. I also looked at mental health research during my project. Studies suggest that a very high percentage of Yazidis suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma continues to affect daily life long after the violence itself has stopped. However, there are rebuilding efforts underway. Women's centres in displacement camps now provide counselling, literacy programs, and jobs training. Gaining education and financial independence has been shown to reduce symptoms of trauma and help rebuild confidence. Justice is another part of this picture. In 2021, the Iraqi government passed the Yazidi Survivors Law, which promises compensation and formal recognition to survivors. International courts have prosecuted some ISIS members for genocide and crimes against humanity. Survivors like Nadia Murad continue to push for accountability, emphasising that justice is not only about punishment but also about recognition. When I stepped back from all this research, what struck me the most was how layered recovery is. Safety has been improved in the sense that ISIS no longer controls territory. Legal recognition of genocides exists. Support networks for women are expanding. At the same time, belonging remains complicated. Identity rules that once protected the community are now being tested in new ways. This internship pushed me to think differently about conflict. It reminded me that wars do not end cleanly when territory is taken. The social and emotional consequences last much longer. As someone who studies conflict academically, this experience made it more human to me. The war against ISIS ended in 2019, but the process of rebuilding trust, identity, and belonging is still ongoing. And I think that is what I would take away from this experience. Recovery is not a single moment. It is a slow and often difficult process of rebuilding not only homes, but also a sense of who you are and where you fit in within your society and community. Thank you so much for listening.